Greetings. Hello, everybody, and welcome from all over the country and perhaps even further tonight. My name is Deborah Fox, and I'm the artistic director of Pegasus Early Music and NYS Baroque. Pegasus is located in Rochester, New York, and NYS Baroque does concerts in Ithaca, New York, and Syracuse, New York. We're two collaborating organizations, and today is the end of our fall virtual season. It looks as though most of our season for the winter and spring will be online as well. So we've been able to do some new events, and today is a little chat for you about a very interesting composer. Thank you to the technical team working behind the scenes here, Walter Freeman and Lydia Becker. And just a little housekeeping before we get going. If you're logged into your Google or Gmail or YouTube accounts, you can join us in the chat with comments and questions. And please let us know where you're listening from. Now, one of the things that I really enjoy about being the artistic director of these two organizations is coming up with new concerts, putting together ideas for concerts, looking at composers I perhaps didn't know about before, reading and learning about social and musical history. We've done several concerts of music by women composers from the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, and I've really learned a lot. But one composer who has really impressed me consistently is the subject of today's talk, Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. At the beginning, I'd like to say that the title of today's talk really has a wrong preposition. Instead of at the court of the Sun King, it should be from the court of the Sun King. We're going to explore the life and music of this remarkable woman who started out her public musical life at the court of Louis XIV, but then moved on from there into her own sphere. So before we get to Elisabeth Claude Jacquet de la Guerre, I'd like to explore the musical culture during the reign of the Sun King, Louis XIV. Louis was a monarch of power and control, and he had exquisite taste in dance and music. Descriptive words for his reign would include opulence, prosperity, splendor, turbulence, bourgeoisie, flourishing, extravagance, and radiance. Versailles and his other palaces were places where he could entertain the aristocracy lavishly, spoiling them in order to make them more submissive, according to the contemporary historian de Limier, all the while keeping an eye on them and keeping them under his control as they attempted to curry favor with him. Louis loved music and dance. He was trained in his youth as a dancer, and actually he took a dance lesson every day of his life until he was in his 30s. He has a lot to do with the establishment of modern ballet through his patronage and encouragement of ballet performances throughout France. When he was 15 years old in 1653, he performed the part of Apollo, the sun god, in a ballet called Le Ballet de la Nuit, or Ballet of the Night. And in this ballet, he wore a fabulous golden costume as he banished the terrors of the night. The analogy of his godlike glory and his absolute divine power was not lost on the French people. And it was from this event that Louis derived his epithet, the Sun King. And here he is in his other glory. This was certainly not the last time that Louis utilized the arts to send a powerful message. Opera, performed at Versailles, was a spectacle of grandeur, full of metaphor and symbolism, as well as astonishing dance, music, and theatrical effects. The king also held entertainments several times a week in his apartments, with dancing, gambling, games, and concerts. Besides these events being diverting for the French aristocracy, they were deliberately intended to impress the foreign visitors, the diplomats and nobles from other countries, who would then, of course, report back to their homelands how magnificent and powerful was the King of France to be able to afford such luxuries, while the subtext of these dramatized allegories contributed to those impressions. But it's clear, actually, that music was important to Louis XIV for his own sake. Our impression of him as the absolute monarch, power-hungry, secretive, aggressive, and controlling may be true. But here's another side, recounted in this contemporary description of an evening in his private apartments. And our writer says, "I was astonished that he was seated there without ceremony. I saw him dance, and very well. He was one of the best dancers in the whole assembly. I admired the airs which His Majesty commanded to be sung. They were well chosen, expressive, and beautifully composed. His Majesty took pleasure in this and indicated his satisfaction when everyone was content, speaking familiarly to those around him. I thought what a contrast there was in seeing him at the head of his formidable armies, where he is the fiercest of the fierce and the terror of the universe." Now, Louis also played the Baroque guitar and the lute, as I do. And for such a busy and powerful head of state, he took great personal care in selecting the music and musicians who played at court, as well as the music teachers who taught his family and relatives. When he heard a promising young musician, he would ensure that he, or she in this case, was given patronage and protection. His most famous appointment was, of course, the Italian dancer and composer Giovanni Battista Lulli, who became Jean-Baptiste Lully, the head of music for Versailles, for the king, and the virtual dictator of music in France, with a monopoly on opera production. Lully is famous for dying of gangrene from a self-inflicted wound while conducting. He would use a tall stick to mark the beats, and he accidentally stabbed himself in the foot. And after his death, other composers were finally able to compose, publish, and produce their own operas. But as a musician of the king, Lully also was required to write chamber music for the household. And music was used a lot. Here's a little chaconne written for the king as he was getting ready for his royal bed. And it's accompanied by a slide of Lully. And now let's meet Elisabeth Claude Jacquet de la Guerre, harpsichordist, organist, and composer. I think she probably played other instruments as well, including the violin and the viola da gamba. She was a child prodigy, she was a virtuoso, and she lived both inside the court as well as outside of it. And here's a portrait of her. This portrait was painted by François de Troyes, and it is now in a private collection in London. Experts date it to about 1695, when Elisabeth would have been about 30 years old. She would already have been well known as a harpsichordist and a composer for the keyboard, and she was married and living in Paris. The iconography tells us that the harpsichord seen in the lower right corner by her elbow not only shows what she does, but is also a symbol of her success as a performer, and also that she was a cultivated woman. The paper she's holding, perhaps her latest composition, perhaps a libretto for an opera she's writing, shows that she is studious and intelligent. I love that her bodice is slightly open, which makes the portrait just a touch informal, as though the artist had caught her working in the privacy of her home. Now, this was an age when many occupations ran in families for generations, and musicians were no exception. Let's look at the family of Johann Sebastian Bach, for example. In nearly 200 years and 8 generations, there were over 50 musicians. In France, many of the musicians at court came from long lines of music family as well. The Couperins had several generations connected to the royal court. De Lalande was a composer and his daughters were singers at court. Clérambault's father and his 2 sons were musicians, and so on. Now, instrument builders also tended to run in dynasties, especially when the shops were successful and could be taken over by younger family members who would have grown up learning the trade. Elisabeth came from a family that included both musicians and instrument builders for many generations. Her great-great-uncle Jean Jacquet was regarded as one of the best harpsichord builders of this time. His in-laws were a musical family from whom was also descended the singer Anne de la Barre, who was one of the musicians of the chamber to Louis XIV. Jean's son Claude was also celebrated as a master builder. His nephew, Claude Jacquet, Elisabeth's father, was an organist and also a harpsichord builder, and also a teacher of both instruments. Elisabeth's mother, Anne de la Touche, may have been a member of another Parisian musical family, the Daquin. So you get the idea that this community was extended and huge and involved entire interconnected families for generations. Elisabeth was born in 1665 in Paris. She was the second of 4 children. She had 2 brothers, Pierre and Nicolas, and a sister, Anne. It's most likely that their father was their first teacher for all of his children. They all became professional musicians. The boys became organists, harpsichordists, and teachers, and they had positions at churches around Paris and also in Bordeaux. Anne, Elisabeth's sister, was a professional singer, and at the age of 12, she was appointed to serve in the music ensemble of Marie de Lorraine, who was also known as Mademoiselle de Guise. And here's a picture of Mademoiselle. Mademoiselle's ensemble for music was known for its excellence, and it also included the singer and composer Marc-Antoine Charpentier. A description of life in the court of Marie shows that although these musicians were not given official salaries, not the men or the women, they were given protection by Marie in the form of providing for their futures and taking care of their expenses and livelihoods. They were treated well and honored for their musical talents. Many of these musicians, including Charpentier, spent their entire careers in her service, and they traveled around France and performed at different courts there, as well as at Versailles. So here's the Agnus Dei from Charpentier's Messe de Minuit from our concert Baroque Noël last season, a year ago. And this will give you a sense of the ensemble at Mademoiselle's that he was writing for. I love that clip. The singers are just having so much fun. So it was Elisabeth, however, who was the star of the family. Her name first appears in French life in the Mercure Galant, the literary gazette that had its eye on life at court and the intellectual and artistic worlds. It seems to me, from having read some excerpts from it, that it's kind of a cross between Billboard magazine and the New York Daily Post. In July 1677, the newspaper reported, "For 4 years, a wonder has appeared here in Paris. She sings at sight the most difficult music. She accompanies herself and others who wish to sing at the harpsichord, which she plays in an inimitable manner. She composes pieces and plays them in all the keys asked of her. I have told you that for 4 years she has been appearing with these extraordinary qualities, and she is still only 10 years old." This musical prodigy was brought to the court where she performed for the king, who derived much pleasure from hearing her play the harpsichord. He put her into the care of his mistress, the Marquise de Montespan, where it seems she was educated and also performed often for the courtiers and the king. She played organ and harpsichord in the royal chapel and also doubtless in the concerts in the king's apartments. The king favored her with his patronage throughout her life by allowing her to dedicate her published music to him. That was a very, very rare permission that he granted. Sometime around 1680, she left court life to return to Paris, where she married Marin de la Guerre, an organist who was also from a dynasty of musicians. In Paris, her musical reputation and activities continued, which was perhaps unusual for a young woman after marriage in those days. They had one son who was also described as a musical prodigy, but who seems unfortunately to have died at the age of 10 in 1704. Marin, her husband, died at the age of 48 in the same year, so it was a compounded tragedy for Elisabeth. However, she stayed in Paris and kept on with her life as a musician, returning to court on occasion. Now, this was a time of great cultural growth for Paris. There were several new academies for ballet and for music, and there was starting to be a taste for private house concerts or salons. Some of these concerts were quite famous, very well attended, and of course chronicled by the Mercure Galant. Elisabeth started her own series of these concerts in her own home. Who came to these? Perhaps not royalty, but certainly society mavens and aristocracy and the occasional cat, maybe. Also professional musicians and connoisseurs of music. They came to hear virtuosos perform premieres of new pieces. Doubtless some of Elisabeth's cantatas, solo harpsichord pieces, and violin sonatas were first performed at these concerts by Elisabeth and her community of musicians that she knew from court and from Paris. People also came to Madame de la Guerre to hear her famous improvisations, about which was said, she had above all a talent for improvising and for playing fantasies extemporaneously, and sometimes for an entire half hour, she followed an improvisation and a fantasy with songs and harmonies extremely varied and in excellent taste, which charmed the listeners. In 1687, at the age of 22, she had published her first book of pieces for harpsichord. These are solo harpsichord pieces, and you see at the bottom the privilège du roi, that is the permission and approbation of the king. This publication was the first set of solo harpsichord works ever to be published by a woman. It's a set of suites, pieces in different keys, gathered by key, and the suites are mostly dance movements, allemande, courante, sarabande, gigues, chaconnes, minuets, and others. Most of the suites are preceded by a prelude. And in these preludes, we can get a sense of the remarkable improvisatory skills that she was known for. So let's look at the score for the prelude to the A minor suite. Thank you. This is called an unmeasured prelude. And as you can see, there are no bar lines. The clef, the bass clef, seems to be on a different line than what we're used to seeing today. And the length of the notes, you see some whole notes and some 16th notes, but really the length of the notes is left up to the performer. So in a way, it's a little bit like the 20th century aleatoric music, where the pitches are put on the page, but it's up to the performer how and when to play them. This style in the 17th century had been adopted by keyboard players from the improvised practices of the 16th century lute players. Now, in this book of pieces, Elisabeth really establishes her own voice. We hear her style start to develop in certain musical features, which include beautiful melodies and bold, adventurous, and rich harmonies, often surprising the listener with unexpected shifts and progressions. She doesn't end up going where you think she's going to go. This is writing for true virtuosos. Her music has an abundance of ornaments. She writes them in even on weak beats, and she uses the entire keyboard with all its colors. So let's listen to this unmeasured prelude and the next movement, the allemande from this suite. This is a recording by the harpsichordist Marie van Rijn. The instrument she's playing is called the DM harpsichord. It was built in 1679 in France, and according to Marie van Rijn, it is possible that Elisabeth could have played on this very instrument. Thank you to Marie for letting us use that prelude and Allemande from her recording. Throughout Elisabeth's life, she maintained her connection to court, and she also maintained her personal affectionate connection to the king. In 1685, she presented her first theatrical work, a tribute to the king's recent military victories, called Les Jeux à l'honneur de la victoire. The king attended, and apparently later had it performed several times for his own pleasure. In her dedication to the king, she shows awareness of her unique position as a favorite of the king and also as a woman composer. She says, "From the most tender age, presented to your illustrious court, where I have had the honor to be for several years, I learned, sire, to consecrate to you all of my waking hours. You deigned at that time to accept the first fruits of my gifts, but these particular marks did not suffice for me, and I welcome the happy opportunity to be able to make a public offering. This is what led me to write this ballet for the theater. It is not just today, but earlier, that women have written excellent pieces of poetry which have had great success. But until now, none has tried to set a whole opera to music. And I take this advantage from my enterprise, that the more extraordinary it is, the more it is worthy of you, sire. It's really too bad that we do not have the score to this piece anymore, just the libretto. But she did go on to write another opera, Céphale et Procris, which premiered at the Paris Opera in 1694. It's not, in fact, the first opera by a woman. That honor goes to another of my favorite women composers, the Italian Francesca Caccini in 1625. But this is the first French opera by a woman. Showing true currency and attention to the trends of the day, her style combines French elements with Italian features. Jacquet de la Guerre did also write vocal chamber music, which included, besides the operas and ballets, 3 volumes of cantatas, some for solo voice, some for 2 voices, some for voice and instruments, on stories from the Bible and also on Greek myths. And she also wrote some songs, which were published one at a time in sort of collections that were very popular in Paris in the 1690s. They're usually called collections of airs sérieux, or serious airs or songs that were usually on themes of pastoral love or politics. And then the airs à boire, or drinking songs, which are as you would expect. And she wrote in both of those smaller genres. In a salute to the influence of Italian musical form, she also wrote violin sonatas and trio sonatas. The trio sonatas were never published, but came down to us because they were copied by hand by Sébastien de Brossard. And now we're going to pretend we're at a concert and hear a performance of her entire trio sonata in B flat. This is really a marvelous piece, and you'll hear all the trademarks of her style: bold and unexpected harmonic shifts, virtuosity among all the instruments, and beautiful melodies. And towards the end, you'll become wrapped up in a repeating, ascending bass line that astonishes us with its building intensity and the variety of what happens above it. This is from our concert that we called Nevertheless She Persisted, from February 2020, which was actually our last full concert set before the pandemic hit. So please enjoy the B flat trio sonata by Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. I'm recalling that this trio sonata was the first piece I had ever played by Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. I first encountered it about 10 years ago, and no wonder I fell in love with her music. When Elisabeth died in 1729, in her 60s, she was known and admired throughout France. A medal was struck in her honor. Her portrait is on one side, and the other side shows her at the harpsichord. The inscription reads, "I contended for the prize with the great musicians." Pride of place was also given to her in a testament to her fame and eminence by the French writer Évrard Titon Dutillet in his Le Parnassus François of 1732. At first, he had in mind, instead of writing a book, to build a very large monument to glorify the most famous poets, artists, and musicians who had thrived under Louis XIV. Now, this really was quite an impractical folly, like some walls. And he turned the project into a book. And in this book, he gave short biographies of his chosen personages. And it is a very valuable resource for us today. So here's one of the original drawings for the monument. And the highest level is Louis XIV, of course, the Sun King, as Apollo, the sun god. The second level is 3 women writers as the 3 Graces, perhaps the poets to whom Elisabeth refers. The third level are the 9 muses, and they include Racine, Molière, and Jean-Baptiste Lully. And the fourth level, there are 4 musicians deemed worthy: de Lalande, Marin Marais, André Camprat, and Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. Elisabeth clearly was famous in her time, and she was respected and appreciated by the French royalty and by the public as both a performer and a composer. So why isn't she more well known today? The musicologist Marcia Citron wrote an article in 1990 in which she explored why more women musicians haven't made it into the annals of music history. She identified 4 benchmarks to music professionalism, which most women have not, or could not, or cannot achieve because of the norms of society. They are education, publication or performances, critical reception, and composing in larger genres of music, not just chamber music meant to be played at home. And our Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre ticks all the boxes. She had an excellent education, both from her father and at court. She published music, and she had many performances at court, at home, and in public, in the public realm. She was known far and wide as an astonishing performer and also had the support of the king. And she composed in a huge variety of genres, from solo harpsichord music to operas and ballets. In addition, it seems as though she really had financial resources from her family's businesses, as well as her patronage. Accounts of her apartment and possessions after her death would indicate that she was very comfortable. She also had connections due to her family and to the royal court. I'm so pleased that finally this remarkable composer is getting the reception today that she deserves. It's my hope that soon her works will appear on concert programs, and that more recordings will be available, as well as, I hope, another production of her opera. And I actually really hope that we don't have to do whole concerts just of women composers anymore. I think it's great because we bring them to everyone's attention, but I would also just like to fit her in with all the rest of the wonderful composers that we know. But I hope today you've gotten at least a taste for her style and for the incredible vitality of her compositions. So I'd like to thank our team today. Walter Freeman for his tech wizardry, and to our administrator, Lydia Becker. And I'd also like to thank the many musicians who are part of our NYS Baroque and Pegasus early music communities, and who so lovingly and expertly played these concerts and recordings that you heard today. And I'd like to thank you for coming, our supporters and our donors who truly keep us up and running. You know, we're not selling tickets to any of our online events this year, so we appreciate any donation that you would like to make to either of our organizations, Pegasus Early Music or NYS Baroque. So thank you very much. We're very grateful. Let's end with a selection from Jacquet de la Guerre's third sonata for violin, viola da gamba, and continuo, performed by the ensemble La Rêveuse. While you're listening, feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat, and afterwards, I'm happy to take them and to discuss them. And now I'd like to introduce Lydia Becker, our administrator. She's keeping an eye on the chat, and she'll have any comments or questions for me, and I'll try to answer them if I can. Thank you, Lydia. Have you got any questions?
I actually have a private message that just came in saying, what was the process of getting appointed as a court musician? I'm curious as to how Elisabeth's sister was hired at such a young age.
Well, you know, promising young musicians were often brought to court at Versailles, where Louis would keep his eye on them and educate them, as he did with Elisabeth. Often the court appointments also ran in families, actually. And so when a father would retire, very often the son took his place. Also, if a composer was at court, he could bring his children to be hired there, as de Lalande's daughters were as well. Now, Anne was working at the court of Mademoiselle de Guise, and she must have been known for having musical talent and hired. It seems to us that age 12 is very young, but I think that was around the age that young women were considered adults and ready to go out and work. And I suspect because of the musical circles that the Jacquet de la Guerre family ran in, that people knew about the children who were all very talented. So she was taken on there. That's what I can surmise from my reading.
Thank you. We have another question. How does knowing about Elisabeth's background affect your interpretation for a modern performance?
That's a really good question. I think it's important when we play music of the Baroque or the Renaissance or really any time period, even, hey, the 19th century, why not, to understand the context of music at the time. I mean, that's what the historical performance movement is about, is understanding not only how the music was played on the instruments, the setup of the instruments, the gut strings or the Baroque bow, but also the context of the music. Where would it have been played? Who played it? How did they learn how to play it? What was the situation that they would play it in? And so I feel it's a little bit incumbent on us to learn as much as we can about every composer. And with Elisabeth, of course, she had such an interesting and varied life that it's easy to get interested and to want to do some more research about her. I think she fits into what we know about performance practice of the day, and we can compare her music to other composers of the same time and understand her musical quirks and her characteristic gestures by knowing other music of that time.
Actually, that's a great segue for our next question. I hadn't heard of de la Guerre until I joined this group, and I have to say I'm impressed by composition style. I had heard of Charpentier, though. Would Elisabeth have known Charpentier personally? Are there any musical connections between their music?
Aha, wow, very good questions. I think she probably did know Charpentier because, of course, there's a connection to Charpentier through her sister Anne. Of course, we don't know really what their relationship was. And Charpentier came to Versailles, to court at Versailles, with the ensemble of Mademoiselle de Guise. So Elisabeth might have met him there. I just think that in Paris and around court, musicians knew each other. It's a little bit like today. We have a musical community. I feel like I have a musical community all across the country and to other countries as well. And we, in the days when we were traveling to play concerts, we would see each other in different places. We would all arrive. And so we know each other and we keep track. And the musicians who come to Ithaca and Syracuse and Rochester to perform for our organizations, we are a constellation, and we see each other here and we see each other in other places. And I feel that it was very similar to that in Paris in the late 17th century and early 18th century when Elisabeth was there.
Thank you so much, Deb.
Yeah, thank you for that, for those questions. So I just want to say again, thank you to our audience for attending tonight. And we hope to see you in the winter and spring on our series, which we will be announcing pretty soon. We're putting it together. Most of it will be virtual. Well, perhaps all of it will, but we're trying to stay optimistic. So thank you very much for coming tonight, and listen to lots of music in the meantime. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.